ACM membership. We are very happy to have you, David, here. Yeah, the title of the talk will be, what can biological systems teach us about embodied learning?
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to speak. So I am a computer scientist, of course, but I'm going to channel a little bit of cognitive science today because for quite some time I've had the opportunity and pleasure of working with folks in like developmental psychology to think about embodied learning and other kinds of systems. And so today we've seen platforms that people have used for studying and developing autonomous embodied systems. We've seen drones, we've seen self-driving cars, we've seen humanoid robots, we saw quadruped robots and so on. Oh, my Zoom maybe is disconnected, but I'm just going to keep going. Okay. And so I'd like to tell you maybe about an autonomous platform that I've studied a lot, at least at home. So my autonomous platform I'd like to tell you about is this fellow. His name is Pichu. He's a green-cheeked conure. He's my pet bird. And I studied him a lot because he has just like amazing capabilities. So like when I'm at home, we do almost everything together. He eats breakfast with me, for example. He's a very, very messy eater, which is completely fine because he also likes taking baths so he can clean himself up. He really likes taking showers with me, but I don't have video of that for obvious reasons. He's very playful. He likes to explore the environment, even like hanging off of things, even interacting with things that are much larger than him. He has the ability to grasp objects, like grasping things as he like disassembles my sweatshirts, which he's been very good at doing. He can navigate unseen environments like this situation where he's navigating from one spot to another. He loves pianos for whatever reason. He likes to hang out there. His mortal enemy is dental floss. I've never figured out why, but he hates it with a passion. And he is a language learner. He's a word learner. He can say many different words and make sounds to mimic the things that he hears throughout the environment and so on. And so to kind of summarize the hardware specs of this platform, he's kind of different from some of the other platforms that we've talked about today. Let me try joining this one. Sure. Okay. Fence building. Right.
audio input and output.
Okay, perfect.
Just
Okay, all right, we're back on. Okay, anyway, the hardware specifications for this platform, first of all, it's very different from the way you and I see the world. For example, Pichu actually has two foveas, which means that he can see straight ahead in high resolution and off to the side in high resolution. Unlike us, we have this like 2-degree fovea straight in front of us. He actually has two. He's a tetrachromat, which means he can see 4 different bands of color, unlike our 3. He has like an effective frame rate of like 100 hertz compared to our like 20 something hertz. He can learn to produce something like 50 discrete words and sounds. His GPU/CPU requires less than 0.1 watts. He supports full shot, fully weakly supervised reinforcement learning. He has excellent domain adaptation, and he can also navigate unconstrained 3D space in real time. And so this just seems like this amazing platform from which we should be trying to draw inspiration. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly not about birds, although I wanted to highlight that at IU, we have a very interesting lab led by Justin and Samantha Wood that actually does use birds as a way of studying intelligence. And the idea is that going back like since time immemorial, people have argued about how much of intelligence is built in to our brains and how much of it is learned. And it's very difficult to actually do these kinds of experiments, controlled experiments on people, but you can do them on baby chicks, for example, because when a little baby chick hatches out of the egg, it doesn't need its parent there, it's self-sustaining. So what they can do is actually put baby eggs into a virtual reality simulation chamber. When the egg hatches, the chick emerges, and they can control from everything that chick sees from the moment that it is born, from the moment that it emerges, they can control what it sees. And so they can do kind of interesting controlled experiments, like they can show only one view of an object to that bird, and then see whether it's able to generalize to other views of that same object. If it is, that would suggest that, cross-view object matching is innate. If it can't, that would suggest that it's learned. Their results suggest that it is generally learned. And I would strongly urge checking out some of this work. Then they can also build similar kinds of digital twins of these birds in like an AI environment where you can feed in the same inputs that the baby chick received and see what like a transformer model can do with that. And so that, helps us kind of understand how complex is the baby chick brain and how does it match to the deep learning models that we already have. But today I wanted to talk about another biological system that many of us care a lot about, and that is the human child. So all of us were once children. We went through the process of learning to see the world. We once learned through the process of learning language and how to navigate through it, and so on. All of the goals that this conference and this workshop have. And so by studying what kids do using computational techniques to do that, we can hopefully both push forward the state of the art in what's understood in psychology, but also maybe push forward the state of the art in autonomous systems. And so among other things, kids are just amazingly efficient learners of language and of vision. So a little kid at the right age can learn some dozens of new words for objects every day. And they can do this in a very few shot way. They can have maybe one toy fire truck, which they get a little bit of experience playing with. They hear the name of that object in the right circumstances. And then from that moment forward, they can generalize to every fire truck that they will ever see, not always perfectly, but quickly perfectly. No matter the orientation, the lighting, the color, the whether it's a drawing or a photograph and so on, way better than any computer vision algorithm can possibly do. And they do this despite very, very weak supervision. So for example, let's say you are a child and you are sitting across from, in this case, your mother. This is just one moment in time. And that green crosshair there indicates where at this exact moment you happen to be gazing. So you are looking at her face. And she says, Pegbo. And you're like, great. What is that? Is Pegbo her? Because that's what I'm looking at. Is it the thing I'm holding? Is it the thing she's holding? Is it the action? Is it an adjective? Is it one of these objects? What is it? We get very little supervision as kids are able to solve this problem. This is called the referential ambiguity problem. It's very much related to weakly supervised learning in computer vision. So how do kids do this? Well, of course, they probably do not use the exact models that we use. They probably don't use CNNs. They probably don't use transformer models. They probably don't have exactly dropout. They don't have NVIDIA H100s, that's for sure. And the answers and like how the mechanics work lie in, developmental psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and so on. But I think what is maybe a little bit more tractable for us to think about is less about the machinery, which is clearly different, and more about just the overall learning setting, the kinds of inputs they get, the kinds of tasks that they're trying to accomplish, the kinds of supervision they get. So, for example, when we train a model for detecting cars, the average computer vision person would go and find a gigantic data set of cars off the web, millions of images, hopefully. They would download it. They would say that what we want is like as much variety as possible, the largest possible data set, the most diversity possible in terms of different cars, different views of cars, and so on. But this isn't how children learn. This isn't how biological systems learn. How they learn is that they would get lots of like interactions with things like their toy car that their parents bought them. And they play with that car. They see what happens as they move to different lighting situations, as they move it close and far, as they put other toys on top of it, as they throw it against their mother and see what happens and so on. And so this idea of like capturing the inputs that a biological system is getting is in some sense not new. It's something that people have actually been thinking about for a very long time. Tomorrow there's a whole workshop that we're organizing on egocentric computer vision. But people have been thinking about like cameras that you could put on the heads of people to record their first person view, the actual visual inputs that they're getting since for like 80 years, basically. Of course, it's only been maybe in the last decade or so that that's actually a possible thing to do. So we can now instrument people with different kinds of sensors to see what kind of inputs that they're getting. And so my colleagues, Chen Yu and Linda Smith Chen is at UT Austin and Linda Smith is at IU, Jitendra mentioned her work earlier today. They've developed this experimental paradigm over the last 15 or so years, which involves like bringing kids and parents into the lab, and you put cameras and gaze trackers and other kinds of sensors on both of them. This sounds in principle like a very easy thing to do. Believe me, I've observed them attempting to mount a head-mounted camera and calibrate a gaze tracker on like a 12-month-old, and it is not easy. Okay, it is something that really takes a huge amount of effort to be able to do. But anyway, they can bring them into the lab, and then they can give them various tasks. For example, they could give the adult the task of teaching the name of some novel object that they know the child has never seen before to the child. And then they can get this fine-grained information about every moment in time. Where is the child attending to? Where is the parent attending to? Who is holding what? What is being said? Was the object name learned? Yes or no? They can do this in home environments. This is a very clean lab environment. They've done it in simulated home environments. They've done it in actually home environments. And so now suddenly you get all this fine-grained information about a embodied learner, in this case, the child, and the kinds of inputs that they're getting and how successful they are in the learning that they're trying to do. So we've been collaborating for almost probably more than 10 years on this. From like a computer vision perspective, we've done a lot of work in helping them code their data because they collect all this data. So we had like things about like automatically segmenting hands and understanding hand poses for them, or jointly modeling hand and object poses to be able to model the ways that people grasp objects, kids and adults, and so on. We've done some work on like gaze modeling and helping to develop models that estimate where in a scene a child will look or where a parent will look as a function of age and so on. Those are sort of like superficial levels of collaboration where it's basically we're creating some tools that help them code their data. But I think there's like a much deeper level that I'll talk about just a little bit today, although it's all very preliminary work. I think it's very exciting in the future, but preliminary so far about how these two worlds can think about the same, think together and work more closely together. Those working on developing the autonomous embodied agents that we're talking about here, and those who are studying the best known embodied agent that we know of in the form of kids. Now, of course, embodiment shapes the visual inputs that we receive. So, for example, little kids are playing with objects. That means that they get certain views of those objects based on the way that they manipulate them. It also means that they get certain kinds of visual inputs based on the limitations of their vision system. So, for example, we record video like this as an approximation of what someone is seeing, but this isn't actually what we see. What we actually see is something like this, because we have foveated vision, which means at any moment in time, we can only see in high resolution about the central 2 degrees of our visual field. Everything else looks blurry. This is obviously an important consideration, and it clearly has both positives and negatives. Positive is that it restricts the amount of high resolution information that your brain or the little kid's learning system has to deal with at any moment in time. The disadvantage, of course, is that this means you have to integrate information from around the scene somehow, some other way. And if, for example, a child is like foveating on the wrong thing when they hear an object label, it might mean that they're not able to quickly make the association between the object and what they see. So that's one way that our bodies shape the inputs that we receive. Another way this happens is that because we are embodied, the visual inputs and the kinds of interactions that we have with the world just naturally change as we get older. So when we're little, we are mostly held by parents, we're in cribs, we're staring up at the ceiling a lot, then we start crawling, and we start walking, then we start doing other things, right? And so you can look at like the visual inputs kids get as recorded by Linda and others, for example, as a function of age. And she has collected this kind of amazing data set that's small by computer vision standards. I think it's several hundred hours of video, but very difficult to collect, of actual like first person gaze and camera data in the homes of about 100 kids as they grew up longitudinally from about 3 weeks old all the way up to 24 months old. And it turns out, as is pretty obvious probably, that the training data that the kids get changes over time. So it turns out that when you are very young, like the first few weeks of your life, you see a lot of faces. There's almost always a face in your point of view, in your field of view. This probably is why people are so good at recognizing faces. We get a huge amount of training data very early on. And that falls over time as we start looking at other things. On the other hand, very early on, we don't see our hands a lot because we can't control them. But over time, we see more and more and more of our hands up until like as an adult, like if you think about it, the hands are probably the thing you see the most often because they're always in your field of view that you use to interact with and manipulate the environment. So that's an example of how our bodies affect the kinds of visual inputs that we get. And so from like the child point of view, you could ask then, like, how do these changing inputs sort of drive object name learning? And so one of the studies that they have done on the psychology side is try to understand which is more important for learning the name of an object. Is it more important to see the object a lot, or is it more important to hear the name of that object a lot? Which is better for quickly learning the name of a new object? And it turns out that based on their experiments, again, there's very preliminary, there's a limited sample size and so on. This kind of work is very difficult to do. But they found that visual frequency of objects is what is correlated with age of acquisition, not the number of times they hear the name. And so their results suggest actually that early visual word learning is largely unsupervised, basically collecting or self-supervised, collecting visual data about the world. And then towards about 1 year old, it starts becoming more supervised, where it's more about making associations between words and visual patterns. Another example of how visual inputs change as we age is that actually the just raw statistics of just sort of the raw statistics of the visual inputs that we get and the audio inputs that we get change as well. So as you can see, like, and is clear when you think about it, if you are mostly sitting in a crib looking up at the ceiling, the kind of visual inputs are very kind of low frequency, kind of boring, for lack of a better word. Things don't change very much because you can't move very much. As you progress through development, you start moving more, the visual inputs move more, you get higher frequency scenes, more complexity in what you see. And so, like, a related question is then, from the point of view of a machine learning model, a computer vision model, would a similar curriculum somehow help it? And so this is some work of colleagues also at IU who had this paper at NeurIPS last year, where they showed that in fact it does. And so what they did is they took many, I think hundreds of hours of video collected in the home of head-mounted cameras on kids, and they separated it into different age groups: 2 to 4 months old, 6 to 8 months old, and 10 to 12 months old. And then they trained some self-supervised machine learning models in different ways. Some they provided like a curriculum where they first provided the 2 to 4 month old data, then the 6 to 8 month, then the 10 to 12 month. Sometimes they sort of randomized it. Sometimes they did it in developmentally opposite order, where they started with the 10 to 12 and moved backwards. And then they sort of just, they tested experimentally how well these different curricula worked for training self-supervised learning models. And they found that the visual models that were trained with the developmental curriculum from early to late learned faster and learned better. And this seemed to be due to this like temporal and spatial simplicity, the fact that the early training data was simple temporally, and that not a lot of things were changing, and it was simple spatially, and that there wasn't as much like high spatial frequency, high complexity kinds of data there. And they showed this because then when they controlled for that, even across age groups, that effect went away, the difference went away, and there was no longer this benefit to training in developmental order. So sort of thinking about this even more, the embodiment, the fact that we're embodied, also drives like the types and the distributions of training data that we get. And what I mean by that is, like, in machine learning, I think we have the thought that we have this like IID kind of assumption where we would hope that our training examples are independent from one another. Again, we'd go out to the web and download millions of images of cars and learn an object model based on that. But it's clear that children do not learn from IID distributions, right? They learn from things like manipulating, playing with their little toy car. And in fact, what they get is, instead of millions of examples of different cars from different viewpoints, they tend to get massive numbers of examples of like very few instances of an object. So they would see like their toy car, they might see a couple other toy cars, they might see their family car outside, but generally it's like enormous amounts of experience with those very few instances. This seems like, from a computer vision point of view, to not be a very good training data set because there's not a lot of variation. And yet you could argue that this is actually really important for learning general principles of how to build object models in the future. For example, if you know that all of these things are the same car, then that could help you learn invariances about the fact that the same object looks different in certain ways when you go from environment A to environment B, from illumination condition A to B. It helps maybe the learning system understand what is important about the identity of this object and what is not important. This could be really important for generalizing quickly later in life to other examples, to other objects. And of course, because we're embodied, we also get many other modalities. So we get touch, we feel warm and cold, we feel hunger, we hear sounds, we smell smells, and so on, right? All kinds of other modalities also affect this. And so in the remaining time today, I wanted to just tell you about a couple of studies that we have done. These are all in collaboration with developmental psychologists who are sort of thinking about how this embodied nature of learning in children affects the kind of training data that we get and the way that it might be impactful potentially in AI. Not yet, this is all very preliminary. There's no like Turing Award-winning outcomes here, but nevertheless, I think this is a really interesting area to think about how we can draw inspiration from these biological systems to do what we want to do better. So here's like a first example that I'll show you. So here, as I mentioned, these children who are learning the names for new objects by just like playing with things in their environment, they get certain distributional properties of those objects instances. And we were interested in sort of quantifying those distributional properties and understanding how those properties could impact the accuracy of computational vision models, as well as whether the properties that we discover here could somehow help improve the models. And so for these experiments, for most of the experiments here, the basic setup was like you bring a parent and child into the lab, and there's like a simulated home environment. There's a bunch of toy objects on the floor, and you just tell the kid and the parent who are outfitted with the gaze trackers and the wearable cameras, you tell them, okay, go ahead and play for whatever, as long until your child throws a fit and needs to leave, which is typically only about like 10 to 15 minutes, but still, you get sort of raw data this way of just naturalistic people playing with things and talking to one. And so the toys look something like this. They're familiar kinds of objects. And then from the point of view of the, say, child, we can, at every moment, find the bounding boxes of all of these objects using some combination of computer vision, a little bit of human cleaning up. And then you can see like all of the views of these objects in all of the frames. Now, let's say for the moment that we now have the child and parent who are interacting in exactly the same environment. So there's sort of frame by frame synchronization between them. And we could use the views that they get of these objects as training data. So we could say, all right, the child collected some training data of the environment by exploring it. The parent was in the same environment. They also explored the environment. And but they collected two different data streams, two different data sets collected by these two different agents. And so the question might be, which of those data sets is better for training a computational model, say just a simple plain CNN. And so we did this experiment, and we found that actually no matter how you slice and dice the data collected by the children is always better. It always produces object models that work better on some held out test set. And so this is intriguing and interesting. Maybe, I guess the question is like, why does this happen? What is so special about the properties that the children are getting? And they're all sort of a function, of course, of the embodiment of the child. The fact that the child is just naturally playing in this environment, and their body is very different from the adult body that they're with. And so one difference that is perhaps obvious, if you think about it, is that the children get bigger views of objects because their arms are short and they are on the ground a lot more. And so they get bigger bounding boxes of objects. So this is potentially one reason that the data is more useful. And yet it turns out that even if you control for that, there's some other thing going on, because still the children's data is better for training the model. And so like we tried various ways of trying to get at what is the difference between these two. Again, two agents in the same environment, just exploring it slightly differently. And it seems like one very important difference that we noticed is the toddlers tend to get more diversity of object views than the parents. So this is like a visualization. It's like some projection onto 2D space using multidimensional scaling, or one of those techniques of all of the views of that the toddler got of one particular object and the parents got of the same object. Again, across 26 parents and children across lots of hours. And so you can sort of see that the spread for the toddlers is much greater. Basically, they both have like this core kind of region of sort of very canonical views of the object. And yet the parents have much more diversity. The toddlers have much more diversity of those views. Again, this is maybe for a not so interesting reason when you think about it also. It's that, like, for example, the toddlers are worse at manipulating objects. So they tend to like see different views of things because they don't have the planar preference for holding objects that like parents might have. And we can quantify that in different ways. But kind of the takeaway message here is that toddlers are spending every day playing with toys. They're not trying to learn. They're just like manipulating them in the way that seems natural for the bodies that they were given. And they're self-selecting object views as they do that, which is creating training data for them. And this just creates more diverse views for children than the parents because of the fact that they're embodied. We did a little bit of very preliminary work to say, okay, if there's something special about this like toddler view of the world that's different from the parents' view, could you actually take that same property and inject it into other computer vision data sets and maybe get better results? And so we tried to do this by creating like synthetic training data sets with various proportions of things. So we could construct synthetic training data sets where like all of the views of the object are very similar, or data sets where all of them are very diverse. So you get not without that sort of core central component. And then we can train and test, we can train models on various combinations of highly similar and highly diverse examples. And then we can test on some held out test data sets. And so what we found, there's a lot of numbers here. I'll just highlight here, which is sort of the case where we had 200 images per class because we tried varying sizes of training data set. We found that like the original distribution of the kids, that collected by the kids, was this red bar. And so it got certain test accuracy. If we chose only highly similar examples, you got this test accuracy. So that's, I guess, not maybe what the kids are doing. If you got really diverse examples, we also got a lower accuracy. But if we sort of took a synthetic combination of like half very similar and half very diverse, then we got an accuracy that was similar to what the kids were doing on their own. And so this suggests maybe you could inject the same kind of distribution of maybe 50% highly similar, 50% diverse into some other training data set. So just as like a super simple proof of concept initial experiment here, we took training images from COCO, and then we took some test images that we generated from ShapeNet for 12 different object categories. And we did this where we took sort of the original distribution of MS COCO, trained the model on that, then took varying portions of highly similar and highly dissimilar examples, and sort of measured the performance on held out test data on ShapeNet. And we found that the effect is very small, but nevertheless, if you took the original COCO distribution, you got the red bar there. And if we took this synthetic resampling of the data set inspired by what the kids' distribution was like, half similar, half highly diverse, we got small but statistically significant better improvement, better results. And so the results of this suggest that like the data collected by kids as they just naturally interact with objects has this sort of special structure for it that's efficient for learning because they're embodied, because of the constraints of their body and how they can manipulate objects and see the world from that setting, and that computer vision may benefit from this insight. Let me just quickly show you maybe two more very quick examples of these kinds of studies that we can do, all very preliminary, but just showing how this rich data set we have of kids, young kids with gaze tracking and egocentric cameras can reveal things about what the data they're collecting is useful for. So the second study, we are interested in, can we just take the raw inputs that the child gets during interacting with the parent, including gaze, video, and also what the adult is saying. So no longer supervised bounding boxes that were totally correct as in the last slide, but instead what the parent was actually saying at a given moment in time in order to learn a model. And so as you imagine, this data is very noisy. The parents are just talking to their children. Sometimes they say the name of an object like one little ladybug, or they say it's a snowman, or they say, how about the helmet? Not really supervision in any sort of ground truth sense of the word, because sometimes the child is looking in the right spot, like in this case, they're looking at the snowman. Sometimes they're looking at something else. And so that's an example of noise in the labeling process. Well, we found with these computational experiments that if we trained on the actual parent utterances, just what the parents were naturally saying, labeling egocentric child frames, it turned out that the children could, over time, with enough examples, the model learned on the child data could learn to recognize the different objects. From the parents' data, it could not. And so, among other things, this suggests that the parents are using what the child is looking at in order to decide what to name, because they're trying to help the child learn these objects. And then based on a model like this, you can start doing little simulations that you could never do with a child. Like you could say, if you're the ideal child learning model, when would you listen to your parent? Should you listen to your parent when you're staring at something? That might be good because the parent might be saying the right thing. It might be bad because you might be staring at the wrong thing and get a really noisy signal. Or should you listen to them when you're sort of scattering your attention multiple places? Because at least one of those could be correct. So we can do like computational experiments like that you wouldn't be able to do with the kids themselves. And finally, I'll just very quickly mention one more example of a kind of experiment that we can do. So we can look at whether or not a child is successful at learning the name for a new object. So you can bring a child into the lab, you can show them an object you know they don't know the name for. You can then record the interaction with a parent where the parent is naming that object. And at the end, you can test whether or not the child knows the name for that object. Okay, so this is a very labor-intensive, classic developmental psychology kind of setup. But what we were interested in is, could a computational model take the raw video and audio frame, and audio input, and determine whether or not, predict whether or not that child would learn that word given the input that they got? In other words, can this computational model, are there sort of regularities in the visual input and audio input that would allow a computational model to decide whether or not this is high quality naming moment, high quality learning moment? And we found, in fact, that it can. So there are signals there that would allow the model to be able to estimate whether or not the child will learn in a given moment. And so, among other things, this suggests that the child could have a similar model. So even though they don't know the correct answer because they're learning it, they could know whether or not they could predict whether or not a moment was a good one. And so I'm out of time, so I just wanted to share a couple of quick takeaways. The main message here is that in this talk, obviously, we're not trying to build autonomous embodied systems. We're trying to study the best ones that we know. And embodiment, I think many in computer vision especially think of it as sort of an afterthought. We think of video data sets, image data sets that are downloaded from the web, disembodied from where they came from. And yet bodies are really important for biology. They constrain our learning inputs, the modalities, the tasks, the supervision, the objective functions that we're using. They're very different from the ones that we use in computer vision. The distributions of data that we get are very different. The types of tasks we're trying to solve are very different. And as I showed you with the example of Pichu, they're also very different across different animals because all of our hardware is quite different. So I'd say that we should look for opportunities as we think about the future horizons of autonomous systems and embodied learning. We should be looking for opportunities to learn from the world's best embodied learning system, the human child. And we should also be keeping in mind that these kind of advances might help us also advance developmental psychology and improving educational outcomes of kids. And with that, I'll just say all this work that I talked about was created by a huge team. There's a huge amount of manual labor involved in running all these psychology experiments. And so I'm mostly, almost entirely led by Chen Yu and Linda Smith. If you're interested in this kind of area at IU, we have at Indiana University, we have this long-range project that's now been running for close to a decade called Learning Machines, Brains, and Children, where we're trying to understand machine learning, human learning, all together, trying to understand sort of the basic principles that connect it together. And with that, I'm out of time. I'll just say thank you so much. And here's my website if you're interested in finding any of these papers. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Any questions from the audience?
That's a great question. I've never thought about it. So it's a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, I think like the things that I've shown here are sort of very early suggestions that the properties of embodiment, like slow temporal change, like a curriculum of learning over time, like these contextual kind of things that sort of influence the kinds of training data that you get are important. Whether they would be important in any kind of domain, whether they'd be important, in general, I think it's a very open question. And so maybe it connects to that, and that's like a good example of maybe where there's no physical embodiment of an agent exploring the world. Is sort of by definition very passive, and maybe that's an example of but I'm not sure. I can't say anything too smart about that because I haven't thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Okay, just talk loud.
Yeah, you can just come up here.
You can come up here.
So we have not looked, the question was sort of how does the kind of inputs that we get or the observations we get maybe correlate, I would say, with different developmental conditions, things like ADHD, autism, that sort of thing. So my colleagues who are developmental psychologists have specifically looked at autism, for example. I don't think they've looked at something like ADD. For autism, there's some kind of interesting results that show, for example, let me see if I can get it right. If you look at the gaze patterns typically developing kids over time, they sort of start sort of being just highly distributed around, sort of very unpredictable, difficult to model. And then over time, as people become older, then suddenly they're much more predictable by a model, they're much more stable for typically developing kids. And what they have found is for folks who are eventually diagnosed with autism, in some of the kids, you don't see that kind of change. And so there's still kind of this more sort of random distribution, seemingly random distribution of attention. But whether there's so many different correlation, causation, other kinds of things going on there, it's hard to really define that very well. But I'm sure there are differences in there based on the trajectories of kids, and I think would be interesting to look at. Thank you.
One last question. Okay, I might have a silly question, but
Sure.
I think it's right correlated to the you believe that there's a distribution difference between data collected from children and data collected from parents. There's another line of research that's very interesting called the dataset classification. Like you pick randomly one image from ImageNet and another image for maybe Coco, maybe a CVPR10, 100, and you try to train a neural network to differentiate them. It turns out that this kind of neural network is much better than human being. That human being have accuracy like 70% or maybe 50%, and image and you could train a very simple multi-layer perception, it will achieve like 90% accuracy, exactly telling you where this image is coming from, which data set. So I didn't have a very concrete question to this, but I'm wondering, is learning from different, I would say, data distribution will contribute to your, the model's understanding to a concept, like maybe you take the car as a toy car as an example, like, okay, seeing different view or different projection of this toy car in different data set, does it contribute to the models learning this kind of concept? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the answer is yes, definitely. I mean, so for example, there's an entire world out there for us to sample from, and we have to sample some data points. And so clearly there's some good ways of sampling that data that we'd all, that from that world that we'd probably all agree are pretty good. And there's some that are that we'd all agree are really terrible, like just sampling the same image over and over again, for example, would be terrible. But I think there's sort of this very general question that pops up in many different places about, like, if you have a limited budget of how many examples you can collect, what would be the rule for choosing the optimal set of examples? Would you want to fill the whole space, sort of uniformly sample the whole space? Would you want to bias it in some ways? And I think maybe the argument here potentially is that it makes sense to be a little bit biased, because it might make sense to sort of oversample like some canonical examples or some easy examples, then sample widely diversity. Maybe that's more efficient than what maybe like the naive computer vision well, not naive, but sort of what the statistics would suggest, which is that you should independently sample each example from the environment. Yeah. So I think I think what you said, yes, I think that's sort of right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that's the last question. Thank you again. Let's thank Professor David for his excellent presentation. Yeah, we'll have a 10 minutes coffee break. We will have Professor Abhinav Gupta from CMU talking about autonomous driving in 340. Yeah.